Please do not mock my country's noble but somewhat archaic traditions, which this week saw a man in a very expensive hat reading out a speech about data protection and AI reform on a very expensive chair. Are we talking about the new government's plans to revive some of the old UK government's data protection reform plans, Noyb's latest complaint against Xandr, a Microsoft-owned Adtech company, and proposed CCPA regulations that could be very expensive for California businesses? So the new government in the UK, elected on the 4th of July, wants to introduce a digital information and smart data bill. And the keen-eyed among us have noticed that many of the ideas for this bill come from the previous government's data protection and digital information bill. So I took the courtesy of lining up the old bill with the press release about the new one to see what might survive. First of all, we have these reforms to the ICO. Now, the ICO was very, very keen on this idea and very disappointed when the bill died. They want to make it into the Information Commission rather than the Information Commissioner's Office, which means turning it into a board with a CEO and a chair and so on. Looks like that will be happening. The idea to allow scientific researchers to get broad consent for lots of different processing activities in the course of their research project also looks like it will survive. And we also have part 2 of the Digital Information Bill, digital verification services, rear its head once again. So this is about certifications for digital ID providers, and it looks like this will happen. Some people are quite skeptical about it being an ID card sort of thing, but it seems that it's happening. Next up, the Online Safety Act. There was an amendment to that in the DPDIB, which would allow coroners to get access to children's social media accounts if they're investigating their deaths. And the smart data stuff, so this is in the title of the bill, and it appears to draw on the part 3 of the DPDIB, customer data and business data. Is kind of open banking type stuff, I think, expanding that idea into new sectors. But what happened to the UK AI bill that we were all expecting? Well, it looks like there won't be AI specific bill here, statute, but there will be some sort of legislation relating to AI. Now, back in February, Peter Kyle, who was is my MP here in Hove and is now the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, talked about a statutory code which would require businesses to provide testing data to the government. Now, a statutory code is not a bill. It's I guess a type of secondary legislation. So that might explain why there's no AI bill as such in this list of 39 bills that the government wants to introduce. There's also reference to AI in the product safety law that they want to pass. And remember, the EU AI Act is a product safety law, effectively. So it might be that we're trying to sort of dovetail standards with the EU in this area. So next up, Noyb is taking on Xandr, which is an ad tech company owned by Microsoft. They operate a real-time bidding platform and a demand-side platform that allows them to sell ad space to people based on market segments, which are inferences about who they are, what they like, gleaned by cookies, some of which Xandr sets directly, some of which come from business partners. So there was an expose about Xandr in the press a couple of years ago, which revealed the sorts of market segments they offer. Things relating to health, sex life, political opinions, religious beliefs, financial status in some cases, quite controversial, and obviously got Noyb's attention. So the complainant in this case lives in Italy, so not Schrems. I think I know who it might be, but I won't say. And they submitted data subject requests to a Metric, which is a company that supplies Xandr with market segments, and Xandr itself, and got very different responses from each company. So let's look at Xandr first. They said they couldn't match up the data subject with any data about them because it's pseudonymous and not personally identifiable information like name or plain text email address. Now, it's a bit confusing, this response, because the complainant didn't submit their name or email address per se. They submitted a cookie ID that Xandr had set. Xandr later said they would delete that from their database, but this response doesn't seem to quite match up with the reality. Xandr does publish metrics about their responses to consumer requests, and it looks like they facilitate 0 of them. So they received 1,294 access requests in 2022, and they complied with none. 660 erasure requests, and again complied with none. They publish these metrics probably as an obligation under the CCPA, which applies to larger companies and allows them to either say how many Californians they received requests from or how many consumers globally. So I think that's why they publish this stuff, and possibly their position derives from the CCPA's rules on de-identified personal information. Now, Emetric, the other company, responded quite differently. They provided a copy of over 200 market segments and a list of 70 profiling events created about the complainant here that appear to be quite contradictory. So the complainant was said to be both a woman and a man, between 16 and over 60, and earning between 500 and 4,000 euros a month. There's a whole list of contradictory market segments associated with this person. And Xandr, according to Noyb, relying on this data, violates the principle of accuracy and is kind of mis-selling stuff to its customers. Again, these are all allegations. I expect it's very complicated, and Xandr's response will be very interesting. So other allegations include data minimization, facilitating data subject rights requests, the right of access, and the right to erasure. Noyb again here is trying to avoid the one-stop shop by saying that Italy should deal with its complaint rather than it going to Ireland, because Xandr is not sufficiently owned by Microsoft for this to be a complaint against Microsoft, as it were. So we've seen lots of attempts recently to get around the complaint going to the Irish DPC, which Noyb has a very difficult relationship with and is much less decisive in its enforcement than the Italian authority. So finally, the California Privacy Protection Agency has published some very long-awaited draft proposed regulations that were due in their final form some time ago. Despite the lateness, we are still at a very early stage of some of these regulations in the sort of process, so do bear that in mind. A lot of stuff here. It's a very long document. I've picked out what I consider to be some highlights. We've got a definition of artificial intelligence, very heavily caveated, looks like the OECD definition that everyone else uses, but lots of mays and cans and might be's, and an example here. So artificial intelligence may produce outputs based on explicit or implicit objectives, and they can include predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions. I mean, you're kind of whittling the definition down to nothingness if you include all these mays and cans, but it does give the regulator, a lot of scope for its own discretion. We have a definition of what does not constitute automated decision-making technology. So the regulations eventually will include stuff about automated decision-making technology, ADMT, a bit like the Article 22 of the GDPR. But here we see they do not include things like spreadsheets, antiviruses, spell checking, and so on, unless they replace human decision-making. So we have an example of how a spreadsheet may or may not be ADMT. I mean, I don't really see the point in having this list of things that don't constitute ADMT if you're going to tell us that they only don't constitute ADMT if they are not ADMT. It seems to be quite circular and self-defeating. We have also an adjustment to a lot of the kind of money-related stuff for inflation. Now, this was supposed to happen a long time ago, so it's happening retroactively from January the 1st, 2023. I'm not quite sure how that will work, but the big news here is that the threshold for application, so when a company becomes a business, originally it's 25 million per year in annual revenues. That's going up to 27,975,000, so nearly 28 million. That will take a relatively small slice of companies out of the scope of the CCPA. Likewise, monetary penalties are going up, administrative fines, and the compensation rate for CPPA board members too. We also have a correction here to regulations that are already in effect. And I've been saying this was wrong for some time. I did have quite a long debate about it. The privacy policy needs to state which service providers or contractors a business shares personal information with for business purposes. That originally said third parties, which was kind of contradictory and confusing. They are correcting that. I only include that as a smug one-up on the person that said I was wrong about it, so forgive me. Now, we also have the cybersecurity audit regulations. This is a big deal, and it will affect lots of companies. Not all CCPA businesses need to worry about this, though. So the businesses that need to comply with this are those that derive 50% or more of their annual revenues from selling or sharing personal information, or that meet the 25 million per year threshold, soon to be nearly 28 million per year, and process personal information about 250,000 or more consumers, or sensitive personal information about 50,000 or more consumers. So large companies and data brokers effectively need to do this. The cybersecurity audit happens once per year, beginning 2 years from whenever these regulations eventually take effect. And businesses affected by this will have to submit a written certification to the CCPA every year to say they've done it. Now, this is a very extensive process. Well, I've got a video here scrolling through the cybersecurity audits part of the regulation, and you can see it takes a lot of pages. There's a lot to be done. You can nominate someone internally to do this. There are certain independence requirements if you do, or you can get someone external. So auditing companies will be very excited about this. And the CPPA also provides an economic impact assessment, which suggests that the regulations could cost California businesses over $4.2 billion, just this update. And the cybersecurity audits could be over $2 billion worth of compliance costs. So that will affect about 25,352 California businesses, not to mention those outside California. So that's all from me this week. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, as always, to Bravado AI for their support, and I'll see you next time.